The summer sun blazed down on the crowded streets of London as thousands of tourists packed the area around Buckingham Palace. It was a typical July afternoon, with visitors from every corner of the world gathering to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the sea of faces, cameras, and excited chatter stood Marcus Thompson, a royal guard who'd served at the palace for nearly 8 years. Marcus stood perfectly still in his traditional red tunic and tall bearskin hat, his face expressionless as he had been trained. His polished black boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his rifle rested against his shoulder at the exact angle required by centuries of military tradition. To the casual observer, he appeared to be nothing more than a living statue, a colorful piece of British heritage for tourists to photograph. But beneath that stoic exterior was a highly trained soldier who took his duty seriously. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers, with parents lifting children onto their shoulders for a better view. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. Street vendors sold Union Jack flags and miniature replicas of the guards to eager buyers. The atmosphere was festive, filled with the kind of excitement that only comes from being in one of the world's most famous locations. Near the front of the crowd stood Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old tourist from America who had arrived in London just 2 days earlier. He wore expensive designer sunglasses, a branded polo shirt, and carried the latest smartphone in his hand. Jake had come to Europe with 3 of his college friends, and their trip so far had been one long social media opportunity. Every meal, every sight, every moment had to be captured, filtered, and posted online for their followers back home. Jake's friends, Tyler, Brad, and Connor, stood beside him, equally absorbed in their phones. They had been taking turns posing near the guards, making funny faces, and trying to get reactions from the stoic soldiers. So far, they had been unsuccessful, which only made them more determined to create viral content. In their minds, this trip was not just about seeing Europe, but about collecting experiences that would impress their online audience. The group had already caused minor disruptions at several tourist spots. In Paris, they had been asked to leave the Louvre for being too loud. In Amsterdam, they had nearly been kicked out of a museum for touching artwork. But none of these incidents had dampened their enthusiasm for creating what they called content. If anything, it made them bolder. Jake scrolled through his social media feed, noting how many likes his recent posts had received. His photos from the Eiffel Tower had done well, but not well enough. He needed something bigger, something that would really grab attention. As he looked up at the royal guard standing just a few meters away, an idea began to form in his mind. He had seen videos online of tourists trying to make the guards laugh or break their composure. Those videos got millions of views. What if he could do something even more outrageous? He nudged Tyler and whispered something in his ear. Tyler's eyes widened, and he let out a low laugh. He pulled out his phone and opened the video camera app, nodding at Jake to signal he was ready. Brad and Connor noticed the exchange and moved closer, curious about what was happening. The 4 friends formed a tight circle, speaking in hushed tones as they finalized their plan. Marcus remained motionless at his post, but his eyes tracked the movements around him. Years of training had taught him to be aware of everything happening in his vicinity without appearing to notice anything at all. He had seen countless tourists try various antics to get a reaction from him and his fellow guards. Most were harmless and actually quite amusing, though he would never let that show. But occasionally, there were individuals who crossed the line, and he could sense that something was brewing in the group of young men nearby. The afternoon heat intensified, and Marcus felt a bead of sweat roll down his back beneath his heavy woolen tunic. The uniform, while magnificent to look at, was brutally uncomfortable in summer weather. The bearskin hat alone weighed nearly 2 pounds and trapped heat like an oven. But discomfort was something every guard learned to endure. It was part of the job, part of the tradition, part of what made them special. Jake separated from his friends and walked toward an ice cream vendor who had set up a cart nearby. The vendor, an elderly Italian man named Giuseppe, had been selling ice cream near the palace for over 20 years. He had seen everything from marriage proposals to tourist meltdowns, and he could usually spot trouble before it happened. As Jake approached, Giuseppe felt a slight unease, but pushed it aside. The young man ordered a large vanilla soft-serve cone with extra toppings, paid with a generous tip, and walked back toward his friends with a smile. It did not quite reach his eyes. The crowd continued to swell as the time for the ceremony approached. Families positioned themselves for the best views. Professional photographers checked their equipment. A school group of children in matching yellow caps listened attentively to their teacher's explanation about the royal guards. Everyone was focused on the spectacle they had come to see. Unaware that something entirely different was about to unfold, Marcus noticed the young man with the ice cream cone making his way back through the crowd. The tourists' friends had their phones out, all pointed in his direction. This was not unusual. Tourists constantly filmed everything. But there was something about their body language, the way they kept glancing at each other and suppressing laughter, that put Marcus on alert. His grip on his rifle imperceptibly tightened. Jake approached the barrier that separated the public from the guards. He held his ice cream cone high, making sure Tyler had a clear shot for the video. Other tourists began to notice what was happening, and a small space cleared around Jake. Some people sensed that something interesting was about to occur and pulled out their own phones. Within seconds, at least a dozen cameras were pointed at the scene. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking what the man with the ice cream was going to do. Her mother shushed her, equally curious. An elderly British couple standing nearby frowned, sensing that whatever was about to happen might not be respectful. The husband leaned toward his wife and muttered something about young people today having no manners. Jake took a deep breath and stepped right up to the barrier. He was now less than 3 feet from Marcus. He could see the intricate details of the guard's uniform. The brass buttons polished to perfection, the precise creases in the fabric. For a brief moment, Jake felt a flicker of hesitation. This was a real person standing there, not just a prop for his entertainment. But the thought of the views, the likes, the comments praising his boldness pushed that hesitation aside. Marcus saw the tourist move closer, but maintained his position. His training had prepared him for many scenarios. Physical threats, lost children wandering too close, even the occasional protester trying to make a statement. But the ice cream cone in the tourist's hand presented a unique situation. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The only sign that he was aware of the potential threat. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. The usual chatter and noise faded into the background. Even the street vendors paused in their sales pitches. Everyone's attention was now fixed on the young American tourist with the ice cream cone and the stoic royal guard standing at attention. The moment stretched out, pregnant with anticipation. Jake raised the ice cream cone higher, his friends' phones capturing every second. The vanilla ice cream was beginning to melt in the summer heat, small drips falling onto Jake's hand. What happened next would be talked about for months to come, shared across every social media platform, and serve as a lesson about respect, consequences, and the unexpected ways that karma can work. Jake looked directly at Marcus, a smirk playing on his lips as he raised the ice cream cone even higher. His friends behind him were barely containing their laughter, their phones steady and recording every moment. Tyler zoomed in on Jake's face, then panned to Marcus, making sure to capture the guard's stoic expression. This was going to be epic content. They were certain of it. Without warning, Jake reached forward and smeared the vanilla ice cream directly across Marcus's face. The cold, sticky substance spread across the guard's cheek, nose, and part of his perfectly groomed mustache. Some of it dripped down onto his pristine red tunic, leaving white streaks on the fabric. The cone itself pressed against Marcus's skin before Jake pulled it back, laughing loudly at his own actions. For a split second, the entire area fell into shocked silence. Even Jake's friends stopped laughing, their eyes wide as they continued filming. The crowd of tourists surrounding them gasped collectively. Parents covered their children's eyes. The elderly British couple looked absolutely horrified, the wife clutching her husband's arm in disbelief. The little girl who had been curious earlier started to cry, upset by what she had just witnessed. Marcus did not move. Not a single muscle in his body twitched. The ice cream continued to drip down his face, but his eyes remained fixed forward, his posture unchanged, his rifle still at the exact regulation angle. His face maintained the same neutral expression it had held for the past 2 hours of his shift. To anyone watching, it appeared as though nothing had happened at all, as if the guard was somehow unaware of the assault that had just occurred. Jake turned back to his friends, throwing his arms up in victory. He still held the half-empty cone in one hand, vanilla ice cream now smeared on his own fingers. Tyler, Brad, and Connor erupted in laughter and high-fives, immediately checking the video playback to make sure they had captured everything. Tyler's hands shook with excitement as he watched the footage. This was going to get them thousands, maybe millions of views. They could already imagine the comment section filling up with fire emojis and laughing faces. But the crowd's reaction was very different from what the group had expected. Instead of laughter or amusement, there were expressions of disgust and anger on the faces surrounding them. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress stepped forward, her face red with fury. She pointed at Jake and shouted that what he had done was absolutely disgraceful. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and clear, causing several tourists to nod in agreement. An Australian man with his family moved closer, telling Jake that he should be ashamed of himself. The man's teenage son tried to pull his father back, worried about confrontation, but the father was too angry to be deterred. He continued speaking, his accent thick with emotion, explaining that these guards were real soldiers who deserved respect, not juvenile pranks for social media attention. Giuseppe, the ice cream vendor, abandoned his cart and pushed through the crowd toward Jake. His weathered face was creased with disapproval as he grabbed Jake's arm. In broken but passionate English, he told the young man that in all his 20 years of selling ice cream at this location, he had never seen such disrespectful behavior. He demanded his product back, refusing to let his ice cream be part of such a shameful act. Jake's initial confidence began to waver as he looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. In his mind, he had imagined people laughing, maybe joining in on the joke. Certainly not this level of anger and condemnation. He tried to laugh it off, telling the crowd to relax because it was just a prank. But his voice lacked conviction, and the words fell flat. Tyler continued to film everything, capturing the crowd's angry response as well as Jake's growing discomfort. Part of him thought this would actually make the video even better, showing the controversy they had created. Connor and Brad exchanged uncertain glances, beginning to realize that they might have seriously miscalculated the situation. Marcus remained at his post, ice cream still dripping down his face. But something had changed. Though his body remained perfectly still, there was a shift in the atmosphere around him. Other guards who had been stationed at different positions began to take notice. Palace security personnel, who always monitored the crowds discreetly, were already moving through the masses of tourists. Speaking urgently into their radios, a professional photographer who had been capturing images of the ceremony lowered his expensive camera and simply stared at Jake with contempt. He had photographed the royal guards for various publications over the years and had developed a deep respect for their discipline and dedication. What he had just witnessed made his stomach turn. He considered calling the police himself, but decided to wait and see how the situation would unfold. The crowd continued to grow as word spread about what had happened. People who had been exploring other areas of the palace grounds hurried over, asking what all the commotion was about. When they learned that a tourist had assaulted one of the guards with ice cream, the reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. Several tourists began filming Jake and his friends, but not in support. They were documenting what they considered to be an act of disrespect that needed to be reported. Jake tried to move away from the barrier, hoping to disappear into the crowd before things got worse. But the circle of tourists around him and his friends had tightened. People were not going to let them simply walk away from what they had done. A Japanese tourist stepped forward and told Jake in careful English that he had come all the way from Tokyo to see the guards, and was appalled by this behavior. His wife nodded vigorously beside him, her expression severe. Marcus finally received permission through his earpiece to break protocol. It was a rare occurrence, reserved only for situations that required immediate action. A senior officer's voice crackled through, authorizing him to step down from his post and respond to the assault. Marcus took a breath, and then, with the precision that defined everything he did, he began to move. The crowd fell silent again as Marcus took his first step. He moved with the same military precision that characterized his standing position, his movements controlled and deliberate. He reached up with one gloved hand and wiped the ice cream from his face with a handkerchief that appeared from his pocket. His eyes, which had been staring forward into nothing, now locked directly onto Jake, with an intensity that made the young tourist's blood run cold. Jake stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The confident smirk had completely vanished from his face, replaced by genuine fear. He had seen Marcus as nothing more than a prop, a living statue that existed for tourist entertainment. But now, facing the full attention of a trained soldier who had just been publicly humiliated, Jake realized the enormity of his mistake. Marcus handed his rifle to another guard who had approached to assist. He rolled his shoulders once, a movement that seemed to contain all the pent-up frustration of maintaining absolute stillness for hours while being treated as an object, rather than a person. He took another step toward Jake, and the crowd instinctively parted, creating a clear path between the guard and the tourist. Tyler's phone continued to record, but his hands were now shaking for an entirely different reason. He had wanted to capture something viral, but what he was witnessing now had taken on a dimension he had not anticipated. Brad grabbed Connor's arm, both of them backing away slowly, trying to distance themselves from Jake as if that might absolve them of involvement in what had happened. Marcus stood directly in front of Jake now, the height difference making the guards seem even more imposing. The summer heat seemed to intensify, or perhaps it was just the tension in the air making. Marcus looked directly into Jake's eyes with an unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through every defense the young tourist might have had. His voice was steady and clear, carrying across the silent crowd with the kind of authority that came from years of military training and discipline. He did not shout or raise his voice. He did not need to. He told Jake that what he had just done was not a harmless prank or a joke for social media. He explained that the uniform Jake had just defiled represented hundreds of years of British military tradition and honor. He spoke about the soldiers who had worn similar uniforms in wars, conflicts, and peacekeeping missions around the world. He mentioned the guards who had stood at their posts through bombings during World War II, never abandoning their duty even when their lives were at risk. Marcus continued speaking, his words measured and powerful. He told Jake that he himself had served in Afghanistan before becoming a Royal Guard. He had seen friends injured and killed in combat. He had returned home with memories that haunted him at night. Standing at this post, wearing this uniform, was not just a tourist attraction or a photo opportunity. It was a continuation of service to his country, a role he took seriously and performed with pride. The crowd listened in absolute silence. Many tourists had tears in their eyes. The woman in the floral dress who had shouted at Jake earlier was now crying openly, moved by Marcus's words. The Australian man nodded slowly, his arm around his teenage son's shoulders. Using this moment as an unexpected teaching opportunity, the Japanese couple held hands tightly, deeply affected by the dignity with which Marcus was handling the situation. Jake's face had gone pale. The ice cream cone, which he still held, dripped forgotten onto his designer shoes. He tried to maintain eye contact with Marcus but found himself looking down at the ground instead. The weight of what he had done was finally settling on his shoulders. This was not the fun viral moment he had imagined. This was real, and the consequences were beginning to dawn on him. Marcus asked Jake if he understood that it meant to serve something larger than himself. He asked if the young man had ever dedicated himself to any cause that required sacrifice, discipline, or putting others before his own desires. The questions hung in the air, rhetorical but pointed, each one designed to make Jake reflect on his actions and the mindset that had led to them. Tyler had stopped filming. His phone hung at his side, the screen still showing the recording interface. But his finger was no longer on the record button. He looked at Brad and Connor, and all three of them seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of what they had participated in. The adventure they had been documenting suddenly felt juvenile and shameful. Palace security officers moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the group. One of them, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and identified herself as a senior security officer. She informed Jake that what he had done constituted assault on a serviceman and vandalism of military property. Her voice was professional but firm. Leaving no room for argument or negotiation, Jake finally found his voice, stammering out an apology. But the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He said he was sorry, that he did not think it would be such a big deal, that he was just trying to have fun. Each excuse sounded weaker than the last, especially when contrasted with the dignity Marcus had shown in his response. Marcus accepted the apology, with a slight nod, but made it clear that sorry was not enough. Actions had consequences, and Jake would need to face them. He stepped back, allowing the security officers to take over the situation. His part in this confrontation was complete. He had made his point, defended his honor, and that of his fellow guards. And now the proper authorities would handle the rest. The senior security officer informed Jake and his friends that they would need to accompany her and her colleagues for questioning. She explained that they could either cooperate voluntarily or be detained more formally. The choice was theirs, but either way, they would not be leaving until the matter was properly addressed. Her tone made it clear that this was not a suggestion or a request. Jake nodded numbly, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Tyler, Brad, and Connor reluctantly moved forward as well, realizing that their association with Jake meant they were also involved in this situation. Tyler clutched his phone, suddenly very aware that the video he had been so excited about recording was now evidence of a crime rather than viral content. As the security officers began to escort the group away from the crowd, tourists started to applaud. It began with a few claps from the elderly British couple, then spread through the entire gathering. People applauded for Marcus, for his dignity and restraint, for the way he had handled an incredibly disrespectful situation with grace and authority. They applauded for justice being served and for the lesson being taught. Marcus returned to his post, accepting his rifle back from his fellow guard with a brief nod of thanks. Another guard appeared with a cloth and helped clean the remaining ice cream from his uniform. Within minutes, Marcus was back in position, his face once again neutral and forward-facing, as if nothing had happened. But everyone who had witnessed the event knew that something significant had occurred. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though many people lingered, discussing what they had seen. Parents used the incident to teach their children about respect and consequences. Tour guides incorporated the story into their presentations, explaining that the guards were not props but real soldiers deserving of dignity. Giuseppe returned to his ice cream cart, still shaking his head in disgust, but also with a sense of satisfaction that justice was being served. Inside the palace security office, Jake and his friends sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, facing serious consequences for what had started as a thoughtless attempt at viral fame. The room was sterile and official, with portraits of the royal family on the walls and filing cabinets full of incident reports. A desk sergeant was typing up their information, his fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard as he documented every detail of what had occurred. The senior security officer sat across from them, joined by 2 police constables who had been called in to handle the criminal aspects of the case. She laid out exactly what would happen next. Jake would be charged with assault and vandalism. His friends, as accomplices who had encouraged and filmed the act, would face lesser charges, but charges nonetheless. All of them would be required to appear before a magistrate. Jake asked what this meant for his trip, his voice barely above a whisper. The security officer explained that his passport would be held until the legal proceedings were complete. He would not be allowed to leave the country until the matter was resolved. His friends received similar news. Their European adventure was effectively over, replaced by legal consultations, court appearances, the very real possibility of criminal records. Tyler mentioned the video on his phone, asking if they needed to see it. One of the police constables informed him that the video would indeed be required as evidence and that he should hand over his device immediately. Tyler hesitated for a moment, thinking about all the other content on his phone, but the constable's stern expression made it clear this was not optional. He unlocked the phone and handed it over. The constable scrolled through the video, his expression growing more disapproving with each second. He showed it to his colleague, who shook her head in disgust. They made copies of the video and returned the phone to Tyler, warning him that deleting any evidence would result in additional charges of obstruction of justice. Tyler nodded. His earlier dreams of viral fame now a nightmare of legal consequences. Brad asked about bail or whether they could pay a fine to make this go away. The security officer explained that this was not how the British legal system worked. They would be released on their own recognizance after processing, but they would have to appear in court at a scheduled date. Failing to appear would result in arrest warrants and much more serious consequences. Their passports would be held at the American embassy under legal notice. Connor, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. He asked what would happen to Marcus, whether he would get in trouble for leaving his post. The security officer's expression softened slightly at this question. She explained that Marcus had acted completely within protocol and had, in fact, shown remarkable restraint. He would face no disciplinary action whatsoever. In fact, his commanding officers had already commended him for how he handled the situation. The processing continued for another hour. Jake and his friends had their photographs taken, their fingerprints recorded, and their statements documented. Each of them had to provide contact information, local addresses where they would be staying, and emergency contacts back in America. The bureaucratic machinery of justice moved forward with methodical efficiency, ensuring that every detail was properly recorded and filed. When they were finally allowed to leave, it was early evening. The summer sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the London streets. Jake walked out of the palace security building feeling completely different from the confident young man who had entered the area that morning. His designer sunglasses felt ridiculous now, his branded clothing like a costume he no longer wanted to wear. The four friends walked through the London streets in heavy silence, their earlier excitement and energy completely drained. The city around them continued its evening routines with people heading home from work, tourists enjoying dinner at outdoor cafes, and street performers entertaining crowds. But Jake and his friends moved through it all like ghosts, isolated in their own bubble of shame and worry. They reached their hostel in the Paddington area about 30 minutes later. The building was a converted Victorian townhouse that catered to budget travelers. The common room was filled with young backpackers sharing stories and planning their next adventures. The cheerful atmosphere felt like a mockery of their current situation. They climbed the stairs to their shared room without speaking to anyone, ignoring the friendly greetings from other guests, inside their cramped room with its 4 bunk beds and a single small window. The reality of what had happened finally hit them fully. Connor sat on his bed with his head in his hands. Brad paced back and forth in the limited space available, running his fingers through his hair repeatedly. Tyler stared at his phone, scrolling through the footage he had captured. Watching it with completely different eyes than he had just hours earlier, Jake collapsed onto his bottom bunk and stared at the mattress above him. His mind raced through everything that had happened. The confident smirk he had worn while approaching Marcus seemed to belong to a different person entirely. He could still see the look in the guard's eyes when he had finally broken his stance and confronted Jake. It was not anger exactly, though there was certainly that. It was disappointment. And somehow that felt worse. Tyler broke the silence by asking what they were going to tell their parents. His voice cracked slightly on the word parents, revealing the fear beneath the question. They were all adults, technically. but facing criminal charges in a foreign country suddenly made them feel very young and very far from home. Brad stopped pacing and turned to look at Tyler, but he had no answer to offer. Connor suggested they should call a lawyer, but none of them knew any lawyers in London or even how to find one. Jake remembered that the security officer had mentioned they could contact the American embassy for assistance with legal matters. He pulled out the information packet they had been given upon release and found the embassy contact details. But the thought of making that call, of officially involving more authorities and making this situation even more real, paralyzed him. Brad finally sat down on his bed and said they needed to face facts. They were in serious trouble, and pretending otherwise would not help. He pointed out that they had exactly 3 weeks before their scheduled return flights home. But those flights were now meaningless, since their passports were being held. They would need to find a way to extend their accommodation, probably find jobs to pay for food and legal fees, and somehow navigate a foreign legal system. The weight of these practical concerns added another layer to their situation. Their travel funds, which had seemed generous for a 3-week vacation, would not stretch to cover an indefinite stay, plus legal expenses. Tyler's part-time job at a coffee shop back home would not hold his position if he did not return on time. Brad had been scheduled to start an internship at his father's company. Connor was supposed to begin his final semester of college. Jake's situation was perhaps the most serious since he was the one who had actually committed the assault. The others might face lighter consequences as accessories, but Jake would bear the full weight of the charges. He thought about his parents, hard-working people who had saved for years to help fund his education and this graduation trip. They had been so proud when he left for Europe, excited for the experiences he would have. Now, he would have to call them and explain that he had been charged with assaulting a soldier for a social media prank. The room grew dark as evening turned to night. None of them bothered to turn on the lights. They simply sat in the gathering darkness, each lost in their own thoughts and regrets. Outside, London continued its vibrant existence. But inside that small, hostile room, time seemed to have stopped at the moment Jake had smeared ice cream across Marcus's face. Around midnight, Tyler finally spoke again. He said he had been thinking about what Marcus had said. It's about service and sacrifice and dedicating yourself to something larger than your own desires. He admitted that he had never really thought about the guards as real people before. They were just part of the scenery, like Big Ben or Tower Bridge, things that existed for tourists to photograph and experience. The realization of how dehumanizing that perspective was hit him hard. Brad agreed, adding that his own father had served in the military before starting his business career. He had grown up hearing stories about military discipline and honor, but had never really connected those abstract concepts to the actual people who lived them. Seeing Marcus stand there with ice cream dripping down his face, maintaining his composure and dignity, had made it suddenly very real and very personal. Connor confessed that he had been the one who initially suggested they try to get reactions from the guards. He had seen those viral videos online and thought it would be fun to create their own version. The fact that his suggestion had led to this disaster filled him with guilt. He apologized to Jake, though Jake pointed out that he was the one who had actually done it, who had taken the idea too far. Jake sat up on his bunk and turned on the small reading light attached to the bed frame. His face in the dim glow looked older somehow, as if he had aged years in a single day. He told his friends that what Marcus had said about serving in Afghanistan kept replaying in his mind. Here was someone who had actually risked his life for his country, who had seen things Jake could not even imagine, and Jake had treated him like a joke, like an object that existed solely for entertainment. The conversation continued through the early hours of the morning. They talked about responsibility and consequences, about respect and dignity, about the difference between confidence and arrogance. They discussed how social media had warped their sense of what was acceptable, how the pursuit of likes and views had made them do something they never would have considered in a different context. They wondered when creating content had become more important than being decent human beings. Tyler suggested. They should delete all their social media accounts. Brad said that was too extreme, but maybe they needed to rethink how they used those platforms. Connor pointed out that the damage was already done, that the video Tyler had recorded was now evidence in a criminal case and would likely become public record. They could delete their accounts, but this incident would follow them regardless. Jake made a decision. He told his friends that when they went to court, he would take full responsibility. He would not try to minimize what he had done or make excuses. He would face the consequences of his actions like Marcus had faced his duty at that post. It was the least he could do to try to salvage some dignity from this situation. His friends protested, saying they were all involved. But Jake was firm in his resolve. The next morning arrived with gray skies and light rain, fitting the mood perfectly. Jake woke early after barely sleeping and made the call he had been dreading. His mother answered on the third ring, her voice bright and happy, asking how the trip was going. Jake felt his throat tighten as he began to explain what had happened. He heard the confusion in her voice turn to shock, then disappointment, then worry as the full story came out. His father got on the phone, and Jake had to explain everything again. His father's military background made the conversation even more difficult. There was a long silence after Jake finished speaking. It's a silence that seemed to stretch for hours, but was probably only seconds. Then his father said they would help him through this, but Jake would need to face the full consequences of his actions. There would be no attempting to use connections or money to make the problem disappear. His father said he was disappointed but still loved. The next afternoon, Jake sat in Margaret Lawson's office in a professional building near the Old Bailey courthouse. The office was traditional and elegant, with dark wood furniture, leather chairs, and shelves lined with law books. Margaret herself was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of complete competence. She listened to Jake's account of the incident without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Jake finished, Margaret set down her pen and looked at him directly. She told him that his case was straightforward from a legal perspective, but complicated from a practical one. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There were multiple videos from different angles, dozens of witnesses, and his own admission of guilt. The charge of assaulting a serviceman was serious, and the fact that it happened at a royal residence made it even more significant. Margaret explained that he had essentially three options. First, he could plead not guilty and take the case to trial. But given the evidence, this would almost certainly result in a conviction and potentially a harsher sentence for wasting the court's time. Second, he could plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court, hoping for leniency. Third, he could attempt to negotiate with the Crown Prosecution Service for a reduced charge in exchange for a guilty plea and possibly some form of restitution or community service. Jake asked what kind of sentence he might face. Margaret was honest with him. Assault on a serviceman could carry up to 6 months in prison, though first-time offenders who showed genuine remorse and pleaded guilty often received suspended sentences, community service, or substantial fines instead. The vandalism charge for damaging the uniform was less serious, but would be considered alongside the assault. Much would depend on the magistrate assigned to the case and how Jake presented himself in court. She told him that his best strategy would be to demonstrate genuine remorse, not just for getting caught, but for the actual harm he had caused. The court would want to see that he understood why his actions were wrong and that he had learned from the experience. She advised him to write a formal letter of apology to Marcus, though it would need to go through proper channels. She also suggested that he consider doing volunteer work while waiting for the trial, perhaps with a military charity. To show his commitment to making amends, Jake left the meeting with a mixture of clarity and dread. The path forward was clearer now, but the potential consequences felt more real than ever. Margaret had agreed to take his case for a fee that would drain his savings and require help from his parents. But she seemed competent and genuinely interested in getting him the best outcome possible. She scheduled another meeting for the following week to begin preparing his defense strategy. Back at the hostel, Jake shared what he had learned with his friends. Tyler, Brad, and Connor had also consulted with solicitors, and their situations were similar, though slightly less severe. They all agreed to follow Margaret's advice about demonstrating genuine remorse, through actions rather than just words. Connor found a charity that supported veterans and volunteered to help with their fundraising efforts. Tyler began volunteering at a homeless shelter that served many former service members. Brad used his business skills to help organize a charity event. Jake took Margaret's advice seriously and began researching military charities in London. He found an organization called Help for Heroes that supported wounded and sick service members and veterans. He contacted them, explained his situation honestly, and asked if he could volunteer. The coordinator he spoke with was initially skeptical given the circumstances, but Jake's sincerity came through, and she agreed to let him help with administrative work at their office. The days turned into weeks as Jake and his friends settled into their unexpected, extended stay in London. They moved from the expensive hostel to a cheaper flat share in East London, found part-time jobs to pay for their living expenses, and spent their free time volunteering. The experience was transforming them in ways their planned vacation never would have. Jake found himself genuinely moved by the stories of the veterans he met through his volunteer work. He heard about injuries sustained in combat, about the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life, about the ongoing struggles with physical and mental health issues. One veteran named Robert, who had lost both legs in Iraq, became something of a mentor to Jake. Robert could have been bitter about what Jake had done to Marcus, but instead he used it as an opportunity to educate Jake about military service and sacrifice. Robert invited Jake to attend a support group meeting for veterans. Jake hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but Robert insisted. At the meeting, Jake heard stories that broke his heart and inspired him in equal measure. He heard about friendships forged in impossible circumstances, about courage displayed in moments of terror, about the pride these men and women felt in their service despite the costs. He began to understand on a deeper level what Marcus had tried to tell him that day outside the palace. Through Robert, Jake learned that Marcus had actually been something of a hero during his deployment in Afghanistan. He had saved 3 members of his unit when their vehicle was hit by an improvised explosive device, pulling them from the wreckage under enemy fire. He had received a commendation for bravery, though he never spoke about it publicly. This information, which Robert shared with permission, made Jake feel even worse about what he had done, but also more determined to make genuine amends. Tyler's experience at the homeless shelter was equally eye-opening. He met several former soldiers who had struggled with post-traumatic stress and substance abuse after leaving the military. One man named David had once been a Royal Marine, but had ended up on the streets after his marriage fell apart and his mental health declined. David told Tyler that the discipline and structure of military life had given him purpose, and losing that after discharge had left him adrift. David's story helped Tyler understand why the Royal Guards took their ceremonial duties so seriously. It was not just about tradition or tourist entertainment. It was about maintaining that discipline, that sense of purpose, that connection to something larger than themselves. The uniform, the protocols, the unwavering stance. These were all part of maintaining the standards that defined them as soldiers. Brad's work organizing. A charity event brought him into contact with families of service members. He met spouses who had held their families together through multiple deployments. Children who had grown up with parents constantly in danger. Parents who had lost sons and daughters in service to their country. These interactions gave him a profound appreciation for the sacrifices made not just by soldiers, but by everyone connected to them. Connor discovered, through his volunteering, that many veterans struggled with feeling invisible or taken for granted by the public they had served. They often felt that civilians did not understand or appreciate what they had been through. This helped Connor understand why what Jake had done was so offensive. It was not just about one guard being disrespected. It was about the broader societal tendency to take military service for granted, to see soldiers as props or symbols rather than as human beings making real sacrifices. As the weeks passed, Jake received notice that his court date had been set for 6 weeks after the incident. Margaret had been in communication with the Crown Prosecution Service and had managed to negotiate a somewhat favorable arrangement. If Jake pleaded guilty, showed genuine remorse, and the court was satisfied with the character witnesses and evidence of his volunteer work, there was a good chance he would receive a suspended sentence in community service rather than actual jail time. The condition, however, was that Jake would need to make a public apology. Not just a written letter, but an actual face-to-face apology to Marcus. Margaret explained that the prosecution had consulted with Marcus and his commanding officers, and they were willing to accept this arrangement if the apology was sincere. This was both a relief and a source of intense anxiety for Jake. He wanted the opportunity to apologize properly, but the thought of facing Marcus again terrified him. Margaret arranged for the meeting to take place at a neutral location, a conference room at the military barracks where Marcus was stationed. Jake would be accompanied by Margaret, and Marcus would have his commanding officer present as well. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days before the court date, giving the prosecution time to assess Jake's sincerity before the hearing. Jake barely slept the night before the meeting. He had written and rewritten what he wanted to say dozens of times, but nothing seemed adequate. How could words possibly convey the depth of his regret or make up for the disrespect he had shown? He finally decided to speak from the heart rather than from a prepared script, trusting that his genuine feelings would come through better than rehearsed phrases. The barracks were located in Wellington, about an hour outside of London. Jake and Margaret took a train, arriving 15 minutes early for the appointed time. They were met at the gate by a young soldier who checked their identification and escorted them to the administration building. The walk through the barracks grounds was sobering for Jake. He saw soldiers in training, heard drill instructors calling out commands, witnessed the discipline and order that characterized military life. They were shown to a conference room with a long table and several chairs. The walls were decorated with photographs of different military units and their achievements over the years. Jake sat down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to calm his racing heart. Margaret sat beside him, reviewing some papers, but mostly there for moral support and legal guidance if needed. The door opened, and Marcus entered with his commanding officer, a stern-looking man in his 50s named Colonel Henderson. Both men were in uniform, though Marcus was not wearing the ceremonial red tunic but standard military dress. Jake stood immediately, a sign of respect that Margaret had coached him on. Marcus and the colonel sat down across the table, their expressions neutral but not hostile. Colonel Henderson spoke first, explaining the purpose of the meeting. He said that Marcus had agreed to this arrangement because he believed in giving people opportunities to learn and grow from their mistakes. However, the sincerity of Jake's remorse would determine whether this matter could be resolved without a prison sentence. He made it clear that they were not there to make Jake feel better about himself, but to determine whether justice could be served through rehabilitation rather than punishment. Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him. Not as a tourist attraction or a prop for content, but as a person who deserved respect and dignity. Marcus met his gaze steadily, waiting. The silence in the room felt heavy with expectation and the weight of what needed to be said. Jake began speaking, his voice slightly shaky at first but growing stronger as he continued. He told Marcus that he was deeply sorry for what he had done. He explained that he had come to London thinking of the royal guards as part of the scenery, as living statues that existed for entertainment. He admitted that he had been so focused on getting views and likes on social media that he had completely dehumanized Marcus and what he represented. He talked about the past weeks, about the veterans he had met through his volunteer work, about the stories he had heard of sacrifice and service. He mentioned Robert and David by name, explaining how their experiences had helped him understand what Marcus had tried to tell him that day outside the palace. He said he now understood that the uniform Marcus wore represented real soldiers who had fought and died, who had been wounded and traumatized, who had given years of their lives in service to their country. Jake's voice cracked as he continued. He told Marcus that learning about his service in Afghanistan, about the lives he had saved and the dangers he had faced, had made Jake realize just how serious his disrespect had been. He had not just smeared ice cream on a guard's face. He had disrespected every soldier who had ever worn that uniform, everyone who had sacrificed for their country, every family that had lost someone in service. He admitted that before this incident. He had thought military service was something abstract, something that happened to other people in distant places. But now he understood that it was real, that it mattered, that the people who served deserved recognition and respect rather than mockery. He said he could never fully understand what Marcus and other veterans had experienced, but he was committed to learning and to treating service members with the honor they deserved. Jake apologized not just for his actions, but for his mindset. For the casual disrespect that had made those actions possible, he thanked Marcus for not simply having him arrested immediately, for taking the time to speak that day and help Jake understand the gravity of what he had done. He said that Marcus's words had stayed with him every day since, challenging him to become a better person. When Jake finished, there was a long moment of silence. Margaret sat quietly beside him, allowing the words to settle. Colonel Henderson watched Marcus, waiting for his response. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He had heard many apologies in his military career, some sincere and some not. He was trying to determine which category this one fell into. Marcus finally spoke, his voice measured and calm. He told Jake that what he had done was serious, but the fact that Jake had spent the past weeks actually trying to understand why it was wrong, rather than just saying sorry to avoid consequences, meant something. He said that many people apologize when they get caught, but few take the time to genuinely change their perspective and behavior. He acknowledged Jake's volunteer work with the veterans organizations and said that Robert had actually contacted him to vouch for Jake's sincerity. Robert had told Marcus that Jake seemed genuinely transformed by his experiences. He was not just going through the motions, but was really listening and learning. This endorsement from a fellow veteran carried significant weight with Marcus. However, Marcus also made it clear that this incident had consequences beyond just Jake's personal growth. The video that Tyler had recorded had been shared online by other tourists who had witnessed the event. It had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Many people had commented with their own disrespectful jokes about the Royal Guards. In trying to create viral content, Jake had inadvertently encouraged others to see guards as targets for pranks rather than as soldiers. Deserving of respect, Marcus said that part of Jake's responsibility moving forward would be to actively counteract that message. If Jake was serious about making amends, he would need to use his social media platforms to educate others about military service and the importance of respecting soldiers. He would need to speak up when he saw others treating service members disrespectfully. His apology could not end in this room. It needed to continue through his actions in the years to come. Jake agreed immediately, saying he would do whatever was necessary to make things right. He promised that he would use his experience as a teaching moment, that he would speak out against the kind of casual disrespect he had shown. He said he understood that one apology could not undo the harm, but he was committed to spending as much time as necessary making amends through his actions. Colonel Henderson interjected at this point, saying that he had reviewed Jake's case thoroughly. He had spoken with the organizations where Jake had been volunteering, with Robert and other veterans who had interacted with him, and with Margaret about the remorse Jake had shown throughout the legal process. Based on all of this information, the Colonel was prepared to support a recommendation for a suspended sentence in community service rather than imprisonment. However, the Colonel emphasized that this leniency came with expectations. Jake would be required to complete 200 hours of community service with veterans organizations. He would need to create educational content about respecting military service and share it on his social media platforms. He would be on probation for 2 years, during which any similar offense would result in immediate imprisonment, and he would be permanently banned from visiting any royal residences or military installations in the United Kingdom. Jake accepted these terms without hesitation. They seemed more than fair given what he had done. The alternative, 6 months in prison, would have derailed his entire life. This way, he could learn from his mistake, contribute something positive, and hopefully emerge as a better person. Margaret nodded her approval, satisfied that her client was taking this seriously and that the negotiated outcome was reasonable. Marcus stood, indicating that the meeting was concluding. He extended his hand to Jake, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. Jake stood quickly and shook Marcus's hand, overwhelmed by the grace being shown to him. Marcus told Jake that he hoped this experience would stay with him, that it would make him think before acting in the future, and that it would help him appreciate the sacrifices made by service members around the world. Jake thanked Marcus, his voice thick with emotion. He promised that he would never forget this lesson, that he would honor the second chance he was being given. As Marcus and Colonel Henderson left the room, Jake sat back down, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also aware that his real work was just beginning. 2 days later, Jake stood in magistrate's court with Margaret by his side. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, with dark wood paneling and the royal coat of arms displayed prominently. Tyler, Brad, and Connor sat in the gallery, having already received their sentences earlier that morning. All three had received suspended sentences and community service hours for their roles as accessories. Their charges were much lighter than Jake's since they had not actually committed the assault. When Jake's case was called, he stood as Margaret had instructed. The magistrate, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Thornton, reviewed the case file before addressing the court. She spoke about the seriousness of assaulting a serviceman and the disrespect shown to British military traditions. She noted that such behavior from tourists was unacceptable and needed to be addressed firmly. However, Judge Thornton also acknowledged the letters she had received from Robert and other veterans attesting to Jake's genuine remorse and transformation. She mentioned the volunteer work Jake had completed and the formal apology he had made to Marcus. She said that while his actions were reprehensible, his response to being held accountable suggested that rehabilitation was possible and that imprisonment might not serve justice as well as a constructive sentence. Judge Thornton sentenced Jake to a 12-month suspended sentence, meaning he would not go to prison unless he committed another offense during that time. She ordered 200 hours of community service with veterans organizations, as Colonel Henderson had recommended. She also imposed a fine of £1,000 to cover the cost of cleaning and repairing Marcus's uniform. Additionally, Jake was banned from all royal residences and military installations in the United Kingdom for life. The judge's final words were directed at Jake personally. She told him that he had been given an extraordinary opportunity to learn from his mistake, without having his life permanently derailed by a criminal record. She expected him to honor that opportunity by becoming an advocate for respectful behavior and military appreciation. She warned him that if he appeared before her court again for any reason, the suspended sentence would be activated immediately, and he would serve the full 6 months in prison. Jake thanked the judge and accepted the sentence with genuine gratitude. As he left the courtroom with Margaret, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that he was not going to prison, shame that his actions had brought him to this point, determination to fulfill his obligations and prove that he had truly changed, and a deep appreciation for the second chance he had been given. Over the following months, Jake completed his community service hours working with 3 different veterans organizations. He helped with fundraising events, assisted with administrative tasks, and spent time listening to veterans share their stories. Each interaction reinforced the lessons he had learned and deepened his respect for military service. True to his promise, Jake also created content for his social media platforms about his experience. He posted a video explaining what he had done, why it was wrong, and what he had learned from the consequences. He shared information about veterans organizations and encouraged his followers to show respect to service members. The responses were mixed, with some people praising his accountability and others criticizing him harshly. But Jake accepted both as part of his penance. Tyler, Brad, and Connor also completed their community service and returned to America once their legal obligations were fulfilled. They all maintained contact with Jake and supported his efforts to make amends. Tyler deleted most of his old social media content that focused on pranks and shock value, choosing instead to share more meaningful experiences. Brad started his delayed internship with a new perspective on responsibility and consequences. Connor returned to finish his degree with a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by others. 6 months after the incident, Jake received a letter forwarded through Margaret. It was from Marcus, who wrote that he had heard about Jake's continued work with veterans organizations and his educational social media posts. Marcus said that he was glad to see Jake honoring his commitments and hoped that he would continue on this path. The letter was brief, but meant everything to Jake, serving as validation that his efforts were recognized and appreciated. Jake eventually returned to America as well, but London had changed him permanently. He enrolled in college with a new focus, studying social work with an emphasis on supporting veterans. He volunteered at a local veterans center and became involved in advocacy, work around military appreciation and mental health services for former service members. His experience in London, while born from a terrible mistake, had given him a purpose and direction he had never had before. Years later, Jake would tell his story to young people as a cautionary tale about respect, consequences, and the power of social media to influence behavior in negative ways. He spoke at schools, community centers, and veterans events, always emphasizing that what seems like a harmless prank can have serious implications and that real growth comes from facing our mistakes rather than running from them. The ice cream incident that had seemed so funny in the moment had become a defining experience in Jake's life, not because of the shame it brought, but because of the lessons it taught. He learned that every person deserves dignity and respect regardless of their role or appearance. He learned that true courage means admitting when you are wrong and working to make it right. And he learned that the most valuable content we can create is not viral videos, but meaningful connections and positive impacts on the world around us. Marcus continued his service with the Royal Guards, maintaining the same dedication and discipline that had defined his military career. The incident with Jake became just another story in his years of service, one of many times he had to deal with disrespectful tourists. But unlike most such incidents, this one had a resolution that satisfied his sense of justice while offering hope that people could learn and change. The viral video of the incident eventually faded from social media attention, replaced by newer controversies and sensations. But for everyone directly involved, the lessons remained vivid and influential. They had all learned something important about respect, consequences, accountability, and the possibility of redemption through genuine effort and change. And in the end, that lesson was far more valuable than any viral fame could ever have been.